Morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've only got about 1,800 years to cover in the next hour. So this is going to be like a jet that's flying over, and you look below and you go, wow, there goes the last 100 years, last 200 years. So we're going to go through, but a lot of this stuff I'm sure is familiar to you, so we don't need to dwell on it. But I don't want to stop the conversation. So if you have a question or if you have a comment, let's use it. I've always been curious how the church ended up where it is now compared to where it started. They're like two different realities completely. How did that happen? And then I started thinking about this idea of evolution. And I thought, you know what evolution has to do with outside influences, right? That affect an organism, as well as the interior makeup of the organism, and how that changes in accommodation with what's going on outside. And I thought that's really a very interesting way to look at the church and what the church did. Now, what I've done is I've split out a whole bunch of different things that were going on at different times, and then you can see how the church adjusted to it, for good or ill. The church adjusted to it. And what we're left with today is all those adjustments. So see what you think of this. What happens in the world absolutely affects the way the church functions. It did 2,000 years ago, it does today. And the church begins, you might remember this verse from Acts 2:42, because we find it in our baptismal vow. That's why you might remember. So those who welcomed his message were baptized, and that day about 3,000 persons were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, and to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. So after Jesus dies, the disciples, of course, are trying to figure out how they're going to maintain his ministry and continue it on. Jesus had an itinerant ministry, right? He wasn't settled in one place. So this is the first thing that has to be decided. If you've got people that live in one place, they're not itinerant, how is it that you share the message, and how are they supposed to live out the life of faith in that place? That becomes the question. And so, first of all, I think it's interesting you have where it says, 3,000 persons were added and they were all baptized. And well, let's see, this is going to be recorded, but that's okay. It's going to be recorded. That's kind of like Donald Trump saying that one, time when he was inaugurated, that was the biggest one that ever happened, and nobody. But anyway, as you go through this, how did the church develop? Well, you have the synagogue is how it developed. It developed in the synagogue, right? In fact, you had two allusions this morning in the scripture of, you could see the separation of Christian from Jewish. And I was really paused when I saw that. And I thought, that's marvelous, because this is the early church talking in the Gospels. And the church was mainly made up of God-fearers. Are you familiar with that term? God-fearers are Gentiles who God-fearers. They're Gentiles who wanted to know about Judaism, follow Judaism. And so what would happen is, in the synagogue, they were not allowed in. Typically, they were kept, as in the early church, in the court of the Gentiles, out in an outer court, where they could hear what was going on, but they weren't really allowed to do that. By the way, when Seabury Western Seminary used to play the Nashotah House Lilies in football every fall, the loser had to sit in the court of the Gentiles in the chapel as we did evensong. They're still court of the Gentiles. They're if you look at a church, if you ever have what we call the vestibule, okay, that would be the court of the Gentiles. So you have the church that meets in synagogues, you have the church in houses. You don't have any buildings. So you have an agape communion, a love feast that people gather with. You have a common, in Jerusalem, it talks about having this common life, right? where people shared their wealth, and then you have kind of a big commune. The more research that's done on that, there's really no evidence that if that did happen, it didn't happen for very long. It just didn't last. And of course, Luke even includes that in Acts when he starts talking about that they started getting upset because the dole of the food wasn't being given out equally. You remember that story? And so you have a split really, really early in the church. There's never a time. Now, see, this is a huge point that's going to play even into today. There's never been a time in church history where there's been unity, ever. It has never existed. And the thing that I'm always amazed about is that people say, well, the church used to be unified. I say, tell me when, where. It simply wasn't. As early as the few days after supposedly this commune started, there were debates and there were differences. And then they had to kind of figure out what to do. And then you might remember, as a part of that story is where we have the first deacons, right? We have the deacons ordained as the ones that are going to serve the table and care for those kind of issues in the church. So then you have this diaspora that takes place with these early Christians, and that diaspora takes place along Roman trade routes. So if I had that a sign of or a map of Roman trade routes, you'd be able to see Antioch, you'd be able to see Thessalonica, you'd be able to see all these different places that you have in the New Testament that Paul writes letters to and other people write letters to. They were on Roman trade routes because that's how people traveled, obviously. And then Paul would then set up these little churches. They were house churches. Even in Rome, you had house churches. You never had a building in itself. When's the first time that you see a building like that? Anybody want to take a guess? You don't see it until about 3rd century, 300 years, almost 300 years after Jesus dies. So now think about this in these terms. In the United States, what year was 300 years ago? Got to do math, right? What was it? 1722. Was it 1722?
Yeah, it would have been.
Yeah.
1722.
All right. So if you go to 1722 until now, you've never met in a building. You've only met in homes. You see? That's a shift, everybody. That is a difference. By the time the church comes into a building, it changes the game totally. Also, what happens socially in this world is the church is contrary to Roman social practices. So they were seen as enemies of Rome. Obviously, you've all heard this before. There were rumors that were passed around that the early Christians used to baptize or used to kill babies and bring them back to life. They drowned them, and they used to drink blood and eat flesh. They were cannibals, but the Romans saw this and said, these people are abhorrent that called themselves Christians. They're absolutely abhorrent. They were considered a danger to the social order. And you had kind of sporadic persecutions. And this is one of the misunderstandings I think a lot of people have. They think that there were Roman persecution from the time of Jesus's crucifixion on until the time of Constantine in 303. That's not the case. That's not the way it was. Most of these persecutions, it depends on who the emperor was at the moment, whether it was Caligula or whether it was Nero or whether it was Decius or whether it was Diocletian. There were certain ones that used to persecute Christians, and guess why they persecuted Christians? Because they wanted to go back to the old ways. There was disjointed things going on in the society. So they figured they could bring everybody together if they go back to the old ways. And the old ways were worshiping the Roman gods, right? Does that sound familiar politically to anyone? I mean, I gotta tell you, when they were doing this MAGA stuff back in, what was it, 2020? Was it that far back? we started all that.
17, 18.
Yeah, we started, I thought to myself, this is Rome all over again.
Exactly.
What they're doing is we want to go back in time. And what you have to do to go back in time, if a significant or some of your society is got this Christianity idea going, then what you have to do is you have to stamp it out. You have to get rid of it. Now, most of the persecutions that took place were local persecutions. They were either the Jewish sect or the Jewish people trying to get rid of the Christians from the synagogue because they were persuading people to not be good Jews. Or they were people, Romans in certain towns, as we find in the book of Acts, where you have some of the disciples were beat up because they didn't like what they were doing, because it was contrary to what the Romans and the Roman way of life. So that's where you had those kind of persecutions. You didn't have a empire-wide state persecution of Christians until Diocletian. And when Diocletian said that what he wanted to stamp out Christianity. And he wanted to get back to everybody had to worship the Roman gods. And of course, Christians wouldn't worship Roman gods. So get rid of them. Those political ideas haven't gone away. They've been played over and over and over again. So you had, on the timeline here, you'll see 33 in the Common Era is usually the date that is given for Jesus's crucifixion. Now, one of the things, and Dorothy was talking about this morning in her sermon, one of the things the early church thought is that Jesus is going to come back within their lifetime. So if Jesus dies in 33, lifetime, well, you're probably getting to 66, 70, something like that. And then in 70 AD, you have the temple in Jerusalem that is razed to the ground by the Romans, destroyed. What do you think the early church thought of that? It's the end times. He's coming back. Here he comes. It's got to happen. It didn't happen. So now they have to deal with that. Well, wait a second. Now, how are we going to change what we believe to kind of figure out what it is that's going on? So at the destruction of the temple is a huge date, because you see shifts in the church, not only in the church. You don't see as much in the structure, because the structure didn't really exist at this point very much. You had apostles, and then you had deacons, of course. You had widows that were an order of service in the church. We find that if you look in Timothy, you'll see writings where they'll talk about that there were female widows that would serve the church. And then the church took care of them in return, because they had no other way to live. So that kind of structure stayed on. It didn't change much. And because, it was based in a house. It's based on small communities of people. Let me tell you how small those communities were. In the first 3 centuries of the Christian church, although Luke tells us that 3,000 were baptized in a single day, in the first century, across the Roman Empire, we're talking all the way from Rome and even west, all the way to Constantinople and even further east to the Parthians in that area. Across the Roman Empire, the estimate of the number of Christians was 0.2%, which were about 7,500 followers. Well, not very many people. By 150 CE, by 150, that increased to 0.7%, and it was about 40,000 people. So this is 150 years, roughly, after the death of Christ. You don't have this massive conversion of people. That's not what happened. That's not what the early church even looked like. But it gets portrayed that way by a lot of people, unfortunately. And so if we keep going, you look at your timeline, you can see by 200 in the Common Area, the population increased to 3.5%. Oh, we're going up there now. We're up to about 200,000 Christians across the empire. I quote, by the end of the second century, Christianity was steadily expanding and its membership was socially rising. The church was becoming increasingly institutionalized, and there's evidence of moral erosion and declining commitment among its membership. Gee whiz, where have we gone? You know what I mean? All right. By 250 CE, there were 2 million followers. Full 2%. That's the shift right there, isn't it? Just within that 50 years or so, that was the shift. Why did that shift occur? That becomes the question. And it becomes the question for the church today. Everybody talks about conversion, but that's not why that happened. You had that explosion because of exponential doubling. Somebody want to explain to us what exponential doubling, that can explain it much better than I can?
Okay.
What happened with COVID? Exactly the same thing.
Yeah, right. The more people you have as a base, the more it expands, because not only do you have Wilma and Carl, but you would have their children and you would have grandchildren. And as each one of them, becomes Christian, and then they have families and they become Christians, that's exponential doubling. So you have this boom that takes place in the church, and it happens not because you have these masses converted. That's not what happened at all. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. What you had was you had families that were having kids. And in the Roman world, when you were the pater, when you were the father, your whole household might be Christian, which meant your wife, your kids, any relatives that lived in your house, slaves, servants, you name it. I mean, you could have a large group of people. They're all Christian. When the father accepts Christianity, the whole house is Christian. Now do the doubling with those. As those guys go out to their friends, their family, all that stuff, then you start having this huge expansion. And that's what happened in that 50 to 100 years that took place. You had this huge expansion. How do we know part of that happened? Well, we happen to know that part of that was not the particular time where you had Syria. It was about a 50-year window where you didn't have massive or really bad persecutions. The safer it got, the more people said, oh, we can do this. By 300 in the Common Era, the Christian population tripled to 6 million. That's about 10% of the Roman Empire. So think about Constantine. Constantine came in 303, I think was his, but he came in, Battle of Milvian Bridge, I think was 314. Okay, so when Constantine comes in, you've got a significant population of Christians you have to deal with as an emperor. So by the time you get to 325, what was the thing that Constantine had to do? Well, he had to get them in line. I want to regress back to one point too, because there's other things that affected the church as well. There was the political environment in society. The other thing is sheer numbers. I'll never forget, in Nebraska, I had my first youth group had about 5 members, 5 high school kids. We just jumped in the car and did all kinds of things, went all over the place, went to do stuff together, went to movies, we did all kinds of things. We had a great time. It was very simple. Got to know the kids one-on-one. They got to know me. I got to know them. It was wonderful. 3 years after that, it boomed. We ended up having to split a junior high group from a senior high group, and we ended up having about 30 to 35 people in each one of the groups. That changes the whole dynamic. You don't know all the kids personally, right? You have to have, and if you want to go anywhere, you have to have buses. So it changes the whole, and you have to have a program, right? You can't just kind of wing it, as it were, which I did a lot of when we only had 5 members. But so it changes the dynamic. So think about the population shift in the church. When you go to 2 million, you've got to change the way you're doing things because you've got too many people to just meet in a house. You've got too many people that you need a program so that you can organize these people, right? Guess when some of the major liturgies started being put together? Around the same period of time. Because you can't have everybody saying their own thing. It would be cacophonous. It would just be craziness. So what you have is you have some of the Eucharistic prayers coming about. You have some of the Eucharist being central. It's really interesting. The oldest church that we know of in the world is in Turkey, and it does not have a communion table, doesn't have an altar. Isn't that interesting? But it's in that really interesting time between when they were breaking from the synagogue, and it has a huge baptistry. Baptism was central, but it didn't have a Eucharistic table because they weren't there yet. I mean, it's not they didn't do Eucharist, they did. They did it at home when they had the common meal, and then they did it as Jesus did it at the end of the meal. You see what I'm saying? But they didn't do it when they all gathered together as one group because there were too many people. So the other thing that takes place besides historical events, they talk about change of emperors and all that stuff, is environmental changes. Think about some of the things that took place. How about Vesuvius? Vesuvius blew in 79. Well, wait a second, everybody. You got the temple destroyed in 70. 9 years later, you have this volcano that's so close to Rome that blows its top. You didn't think the church was saying, the end times, Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. We want to see you coming in the clouds with glory. It's time. Get rid of these Roman emperors hurting us. Even nature's saying this, you see? Paul talks about something that happened in that general period of time and beyond too, and that is a horrible drought that took place in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. So you had, in this horrible drought, you had a lot of famine, and so the church he made collections, like it says in 2 Corinthians, he's making collections for the church in Jerusalem because they're suffering so badly from these famines. So you have environmental things that happen too. And some of those environmental changes, everybody, some of those environmental changes were permanent, right? I mean, it's not just you had one famine, one drought. The drought had an effect on the overall environment, and it changed it. And so when it changes the environment, the people that live there obviously have to make some shifts too. So as we keep going, you have by 325 of the Common Era, you have Constantine's in power, and he says, in order to get control of these Christians, I mean, there's a lot of people that portray Constantine as this wonderful converted Christian man. That's really, seeing things with rose-colored glasses. He was a practical politician, and he said, how do I get control of these people so that they don't continually, undercut what it is I'm trying to do? And so what did he do? He called together all the bishops that he knew of in that area, in the western part of the empire, even part of the eastern part of the empire. And he said, I want you to come up with the whole doctrine of who's in and who's out. Because the church was always infighting. They had all these heresies, what called heresies, going on. And so, because the churches were independent, they grew up around houses. So you would have this theologian different than this theologian, and you have this early writer, Tertullian, that might say something completely different than Athanasius was saying. And so they were debating this stuff constantly. What were they debating by this time? That even makes sense in terms of the history of it. They were debating it like this is where the Nicene Creed begins. It ends in Constantinople, but it starts at Nicaea. And what is it? What are they trying to figure out? They're trying to figure out a formula that they can put down on paper against Arianism. Because Arian says there was a time when Jesus was not. Think about that for a minute. You have the Father, and then you have the Son of the Father, then you have the Holy Spirit. This is why in the Orthodox conversation they had, this is where you get the filioque clause, where it says where the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And the Eastern Church would say, no, the Spirit proceeds from the Father because the Son proceeded from the Father. You see? And the Western Church saw that as Jesus being somehow below the Father, different than the Father. And you can't do Trinitarian theology on that. So they had to maintain that. Arius says there was a time when Jesus was not, when he wasn't born. And of course, John's gospel says, no, he's pre-existent all the way back to when the creation happened. So even from the time of the Gospels, which is probably the end of the first century, you have a debate as to who is Jesus. Who is he? Where did he come from? What's his essence? Was he physical? And see, now they're 100 years past it. They're a century past Jesus's life. Nobody in the church ever met him. You see? So now they're having these debates about who he was and what this is all about. And they had four major centers. You had Rome, you had Antioch, you had Alexandria, you had Constantinople, and you had Jerusalem. And those were the five Christian centers, because Christianity, my friends, was an urban movement. It was not a rural movement. And I can't emphasize that enough. And people get that all confused too. Do people in an urban environment see things the same way that people in a rural environment see them? No, of course they don't. They don't see things in the same way. They don't exist in the same way. And so you have these pronounced differences, but the Christian movement was in urban environments. I mean, it was along trade routes. That's where it developed. So you stop and think about it. Before the Council of Nicaea, if you wanted your child baptized, and they did baptize children, talks about it in the book of Acts, talks about it in Hippolytus, a lot of the early writings. In fact, they would say you baptize the children first, and then you go along to the ones older. So if you baptize that child before Nicaea, there was a chance that child could be persecuted and killed for being a Christian. If they wouldn't worship the Roman gods, they could be disciplined for that. So that's really quite a leap of faith that you got adults doing, taking vows for babies. Well, the way the society was at that time, if the father is Christian, the whole house is Christian. So when you have baptisms, you would have whole houses being baptized, you see? So you had to deal with all of that stuff. So then we get to Nicaea, and what's really funny is Constantine called that together, right? They couldn't agree on their theology, and so they all wanted to leave. So by imperial edict, Constantine addressed the Council of Nicaea. He wasn't even baptized yet, but he addressed the Council of Nicaea and said, you will stay here until you hammer out who's in and who's out. I want to know. This is huge, because by 380, you have the Emperor Theodosius, who issued what's called the Edict of Thessalonica. Now, we all know the Nicaea, right? How many of us know what the Edict of Thessalonica was? It made Christianity the official state religion of Rome. You would think people would know that, right? This was about 60 years or 58 years after Nicaea, after Constantine does his, what Constantine did was said that Christians aren't going to be persecuted anymore. But Constantine said, you can worship whoever you want to worship, but we're not going to persecute the Christians. Theodosius said something very different. He said, this is the official church of this empire. Now everything changed. They had buildings because they were civic buildings. You see, most of the churches that we have are the older churches in their architecture. What's the architecture of? Well, they're like a basilica. They're like a Roman court is what they're like. People were used to it. And just to tell you in terms of we were talking about populations. In terms of the population, I got to find this because this was stunning. All right. By the Edict of Thessalonica, which made state religion of the Roman Empire, the Christian population was 50%.
Cool.
So, in a sense, Theodosius didn't have any choice. If 50% of your population is Christian, it's a state religion. And it becomes, and then by 30 years later, they did something even more bold. And that is, they said, no other religions can worship other gods except the God of Christianity. They did the same thing the Romans were doing when they were persecuting the Christians. Isn't that interesting? So if you've been persecuted for 300 years and all of a sudden you're not persecuted and you get the apple in the tree, you get to be the state religion, what do? You turn around and you do the same bloody thing that they did when they were persecuting you, when you persecute all the other religions. We've got something else that happened during this period of time that's huge, 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 and it still affects the church today. In the first couple of centuries of the church, probably until 180, 200, you couldn't be in the military if you were a Christian. It was not allowed because Jesus died on the cross to show that violence is not what's going to change the world. Love is going to change the world. And so no one in the Christian church, if you were in the military, you were not allowed to be a part of the church. Why would that be? Well, it has nothing to do with violence. If you're in the military, who's your leader? The emperor. This was a time when you had worship of the emperor. Christians can't serve in the military because they have to worship the emperor. You have to worship Roman gods. That's what you have to do in your military formations, right? Well, they're not going to do that. And of course, the violence thing was also a part of it, where they weren't going to take up sword against other people. But this shifted. And all of a sudden, you have, and especially by the time that Christians are made the state religion of Rome, they flocked into the military. Why? Because they were poor. And they could survive, right? Because you no longer were you worshiping Roman gods in the military. So you had Christians flock to it. So now the church had to deal with, wait a second, how do we deal with this violence issue? Church still doing that? Yep, still doing it. Still, how do you justify that as a Christian? Well, there are Christians who would say you can't justify it as a Christian. And there would be Christians that would say, well, there's the just war theory. You know when the just war theory came about? Just out of curiosity. 4th century. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It came out at the same time you have all these Christians going into the military. And so somehow they had to be justified in what they were doing so they could maintain their connection with the church. And I think it's really easy to make a false assumption that all that existed in the world during this period of time, religiously and so forth, was the Roman Empire and Christianity. And that's simply not true. I mean, you had China, you had the Iranian Empire that was going on. You had the Muslims that came in along the 6th century. You had the Gupta Empire in India. You had major empires that would rival any of the Roman Empire. but we don't study those. We look at things from a Western point of view, and that's where we get our point of view, and that's what makes up our thought about what the church looks like. But the church didn't necessarily look like that in other places. You had, and John might know more about this than I do, you had missionaries that actually went into China, and I think 6th century it was very early. Yeah, and there's this, go ahead.
The Ethiopians too,
Oh, the Ethiopians, absolutely, absolutely. During this period of time, you also had issues about slavery. During this period of time, you had issues about race. During this period of time, are these sounding familiar to anybody? We're still doing it, aren't we? You just do it over and over and over again. So the point I'm trying to make in this is not that nothing ever changes, because lots of things change. But the fact is that we still have to deal with things in a perspective that it's not necessarily the first time it's ever been looked at, right? But we don't hear much about that. We don't hear much about that. If you look at your timeline, you go to the Edict of Thessalonica, and then you go to the end of the Roman Empire, and you go into what's called the early Middle Ages. What's your remembrance of the early Middle Ages from your history classes? What was the early Middle Ages like? Why did it even happen? Because Rome broke down. You had invasions. You had an enormously separated rich and poor. Sound familiar?
Oh, yeah.
And you had to deal with all that stuff, and the society itself started breaking down. And then you had the mob in Rome, and they were a challenge because these were people who lived in Rome, but they were fed by the government. And so you had these wheat mainly from Egypt, that fed these people bread. And then there were two things that they said, that the emperor said, that would keep them happy: bread from the wheat and the games, to keep them entertained. We have any games? So you feed them, you entertain them, you keep them sedate, you keep them. Exactly. Correct. Absolutely. And then what happens is, when you have hiccups to where you don't get the grain in, so you don't have the bread, you start having riots. And so what happens in Rome, you have this separation of rich and poor. You have invasions that are coming in. You have riots from the mob in Rome itself. This place is a mess. And so what do people start doing? This is going to sound awfully familiar. They start leaving the city and going into the rural areas and trying to survive there. And of course, who owned these great land plots in those areas? They were called latifundia, and they were owned by wealthy nobles. They said, come on in, you can live on our latifundia. You can work for us, and we'll take a portion of what it is that you, and we'll provide you the seed, and we'll just take a portion of. What does that sound like? Yeah, it's feudalism. Yeah, it sounds like sharecropping too. You see, nothing new is generated here. And then they go from that, and once they're underneath the waves so far, they simply become serfs, because that's where their life is in the latifundia.
But weren't there church estates too that did the same thing?
Exactly. That's what I was getting to, John. This is a shift in the church too, isn't it? Because now the church has to deal with this. And what do? I mean, you're an urban church. Do you make friends with the nobles? And so that you can build a church, for instance, there? Well, who runs that church? The noble does. Same thing had happened in the United States, everybody. If you go to Virginia, a lot of those churches that weren't in cities, they were on big plantations. And the head of the church wasn't the priest. The priest was assigned by the person who owned the plantation. And there's one more thing that starts developing during this period of time. As early as 300, you have monks.
What?
Monks,
Okay.
monastic orders. And you could have people that would go out in the desert and they would be hermits. You had people who, by the 6th century, early 512, I think, you had Benedictine who wrote his instruction of how to be a monastic house and his order and how to do that. Why would it make sense for people to be a part of a monastic house?
You get fed.
You get fed. That's where you survive. Or you would give your children. You would bring your children to the monks and say, and then the monastic house also gained a lot of power because they would gain control of quite a bit of land. You see, and that's what these folks could work. And then the monastics also did one other thing that was huge, and it became so important in the Middle Ages. They became scribes. They were the ones that kept the scriptures. They were the ones that kept the church letters. They were the ones that kept the brain trust of the church alive, if you were. And so by doing that, then you start having the monks had incredible power. Incredible power. So if you look here in the Middle Ages from 476 to 1098, you have more and more monastic orders popping up. You have, of course, the serfs and the nobles. And then as the nobles grow more powerful, they start getting armies for themselves to protect their own latifundia. And so then you have to bring all these people together in the West, especially, right? And who would be the natural one to bring them together? The Pope, the Papa. So what the Papa does, they're all Roman Catholic. I mean, they're all Roman, right? In the Western part. And so what he does is he says, okay, I'm going to become a monarch. And these are my people. And what did we say about power?
Absolutely.
Right. And so by 1098, all the way into 1270, you have 7 crusades that are, blessed by the Pope to go to Jerusalem and free Jerusalem of the Muslim rule of Jerusalem. Why did they do that? Do you have any clue? There are lots of reasons they did it, but the main reason they did it was because they had taught people that one of the ways that you could show your holiness so that you could be received into heaven and not stuck in purgatory. Oh, wait a second, purgatory. I don't think most people know the root of that word. You know the root of the word? Purge. See, the problem was if you had your sins still with you when you died here on earth, how do you kind of work those out, so you can go into heaven? Well, you purge them in purgatory. And there's only one door out of purgatory. There's a door to come in and a door to go to heaven. There's no door to go to hell. So, people said, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I'll go to purgatory. And then people can either have masses said for me, or they can give indulgences to the church, and then I can get into heaven, or I could be killed on a crusade. And you see, then I would. And one of the things that they taught people was that you could make pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And one of the things that happened with the Muslims destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in the 7th century. And so what you have is there was a burning desire. We're going to rebuild that. We're going to make that Christian again instead of Jewish in Islam. You see, we're going to make it Christian. And so you have crusade after crusade after crusade, that you have the Pope blessing. Now the Christians are becoming exceedingly violent, and they're becoming exceedingly militaristic. This is where you start getting this term. What do we call the saints in heaven? We call them the saints triumphant. There's another name. The saints militant.
That's the ones that wrote Onward Christian Soldiers.
Onward Christian Soldiers. And you see all this music even that you still see today, where you see Christians as soldiers and see Christians as military. I once did that hymn when I was in a small congregation in Colorado. I had 5 congregations, and we did Onward Christian Soldiers. Why did I do it when the bishop came? Because that's one of the few songs they knew, and one of the few songs the organist could play. We had one of the Wurlitzer organs that went woo woo woo. And you know what I'm talking about? So Onward Christian Soldiers. Well, my bishop was Bill Fry, and I don't know if any of you ever remember Bill Fry, but Bill Fry was quite a guy. And one of the things that happened to Bill Fry, he was the Bishop of Guatemala for a while, and he was chased out of Guatemala by gunpoint. I mean, the military was coming on the tarmac to shoot down his plane as he's taken off. So he wasn't a real fan of Onward Christian Soldiers. And so he told me at the end of the service, he said, "I'll never play that hymn in my presence when I come to this church again." Yep. That's one of the things we learn in seminary. Say, "Yes, Bishop, you got it. You get to have it your way." So the political environment changed the church? Absolutely. Society changed it. Population shifts change it. Historical events. You have all kinds of things that are changing the church. And then we have something that happens in 1347 that really changes the church. You have the Black Death. You have the plagues. How did that change? How do you think losing that many people that quickly, what do you think that did to the church? How did the church adjust to it? Any clue? Yeah, it shrank.
It would destabilize everything.
Yep, it destabilizes things. And the church becomes the funeral home of society. What? The funeral home of society. The church is still seen as one of the funeral homes of society.
That's true.
That's one of the things, if you were to ever to ask what the church does, they'd say they bury people. Well,
A requiem.
yeah, a lot of requiems. Exactly. This is where you have all the wonderful requiem, man. All this stuff come out of this. So the Black Death was huge. There was, in fact, Tom Ferguson, I think. Were you at that conference, Dorothy, where Tom was trying to make a comparison between COVID and the Black Death? Yeah. That he was seeing it as this is a similar kind of situation. Although I don't know that we've lost the population like they did anywhere close.
That people started to go back to church.
Ah, very true.
Well, I don't know if COVID was regarded as some sort of divine retribution or what. I don't like to go that far, but people, there's evidence that people are actually going back to church in England where they have not been for many years.
Years, yeah. Mhm. So that's another environmental impact, isn't it? It's another environmental impact. There's another environmental impact during this period of time too. In those latifundias, they kept reusing the same land over and over, growing the same crops, and they depleted the land. And so they couldn't grow a lot of things. And so what did that lead to? Even more famine. I mean, they were really in a tough spot. You can understand why they called it the Dark Ages, because there was a lot of death and there was a lot of poverty and there was a lot of, it's just very difficult. And then around 1450, you had something that took place that really changed the picture in a huge way. What happened in 1450 that changed the picture? You all know this. Gutenberg. That was a huge shift, right? That would be a huge shift, not only for the church, but the whole world. And shortly after that, you start having the Renaissance is coming on. You have the Reformation, which is absolutely dependent on the printing press. You wouldn't have had a Reformation like you did without a printing press. And so that also impacts education because people have to be able to read. It impacts all kinds of things as you go along. And why would you have this Renaissance from the Middle Ages? Why do you think that would happen? Same thing happens today, by the way.
I would think you'd be publishing books, you'd be spreading knowledge around, and
Right.
if you couldn't just keep it in the, you know, in the church, you know, it
Right.
had to be out.
It had to be out. And the church might still be the patron of saints, things like that, painters and all kinds of things. But they might be patrons of it. But the fact is, it was existing and spreading out beyond the church, right? And because one of the things that takes place in the Renaissance, which I always thought was wonderful, is that whole term Renaissance man or Renaissance woman, a person who looks further out. Not just in the latifundia, not just in the church, not just here, but it looks further. And one of the things they see when they look further out are the world, nature. And of course, what comes out of that? Science. So you have sciences that are starting to develop. And so now the church has to deal with that. You see? And what does the church continually try to do? What do you think they continually try to do?
Go back.
They try to go back.
Suppressed, yeah.
Yeah, you see, they want to maintain what they had back in 33 AD. They want to maintain that somehow. And the way you maintain it is by institutionalizing it. And if you institutionalize it, it can't be destroyed quite as easily. So they want to maintain that. So they come up, you have everything from hierarchies of bishops to all kinds of things in terms of church structure and church laws. And this is where they start getting into some real dicey areas, right? I mean, what did Luther have a problem with? He had a problem with indulgences, with purgatory itself, and he also had a problem with something else. You remember? With the wealth of the clergy. That's changed quite a lot.
Oh,
You know, but I mean, because, you know, he would say, you know, a lot of these clergy are drunks, you know, they're, and it's not sacramental wine. There's, but, you know, I mean, they're, you know, they're people that you shouldn't follow into the kingdom, because the kingdom they're going into is not the kingdom you want to be going into. So you have people that are going to, the pendulum swung too far and it's going to swing back. And then you have this whole age of exploration, and that ties in so beautifully with the Renaissance, doesn't it? And I always have to laugh. This is so funny. And we're about done, but I got to laugh. I got to share this with you. I always laugh when people say, you know, that Columbus discovered America. Really? Not even close. He wasn't even, I mean, you already had native indigenous people. You already had the Norse that had been here. You had already had the Portuguese probably that had been there. And let's talk about the French and the English. I mean, look at Oak Island, right? Anybody watch that? I mean, you know, maybe even you got the Ark of the Covenant buried under there. Who knows what's going on? But you had all kinds of people. But when Columbus hits Hispaniola, you know, and he says, you know, what he does is he puts in the flag, and the church takes one more step in a very weird direction. It's called the doctrine. Help me out, John.
Doctrine of not discovery.
Yeah, the doctrine of discovery. Yeah. That you were allowed to force conversion on the native population.
Well, and you could claim ownership of everything you found.
Of ownership of everything you found.
And the Pope said, fine.
You bet. Because it was mainly Spain that was really pushing that because of Columbus, because of a lot of these explorations. And what were they? They were, and not long after that, they're making lots of money with the gold and silver and all the things that they're discovering. Sometimes I just think of the indigenous people of this country that just want to scream and say, you know, you're all got it around your table with your big turkeys, and think about this for a minute. You stole our land, you stole our ways, you eradicated our life, you eradicated our language. I mean, this was going on all the way into these schools, the Indian schools that they were putting, it's going on today,
Exactly.
right? Let's wake up here. So that's why I put on the list here, the age of exploration and exploitation, because that's really what it was. And in 1611, right in the middle of that, think about it, you have the King James Version of the Bible that's published. See, you start looking at all this stuff and you start saying, man, there's a lot of stuff going on that's going to impact the church and the way the church functions. And it's going to impact theology. What you say God is doing, what you say the church is doing in relation to God, how do you maintain what happened in the earliest years of the church? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. And finally, in the 18th and century, end up with the Industrial Revolution. And one more time, that changed the world, didn't it? But there are some things that didn't change. You need people to work factories. And the factories are owned by people who are wealthy. So you still have this separation of rich and poor. But now the church has to deal with the masses in cities that are working for the industrial giants that are starving. How do you deal with that? That's where collars came from. Did you know that? These weren't invented by Roman Catholics. They were invented by Methodists. Because John Wesley would go down to the dock and he would take his shirt and put it on backwards so his collar was across. So people would recognize him as a member of the clergy. And then the dock workers would then talk to him, and he could minister to them. Isn't that, what a beautiful story. And what do we know it as? A Roman collar. It's actually a Wesleyan collar is what it is. But you have each one of these phases, and it all comes together, and all these events affect the church. And so next week, I'm going to talk about from the Industrial Revolution to the current time. We don't have much to cover there, right? But I think what we're going to see these same patterns recur over and over and over again. And the question then becomes for me, do we ever, when we see that pattern recurring, do we ever do something different? To somehow try to change the pattern, to somehow try to change what it is we know that's going to be the result of this pattern. And then what do we do? How do we do that? I think that's precisely where the church is at right now. What are the two big emphases of the Episcopal Church right now? If you read national church stuff, you have two emphases. You have the whole business of being a community, as Martin Luther King saw the community, of being a beloved community is what they call it, a community of caring for one another, of peace, a community of loving the world, that you don't see race, you don't see all those other things that separate us. And the other thing that they're doing is that they're doing a huge movement of the whole thing about dealing with racism. And we don't have a group here that's a part of that diocesan program, but it's a big, big, big thing in the diocese. And it doesn't just only have to do with racism. It also has to do with LGBTQ people. It has to do with, all kinds of things in terms of people who might be different than you or that kind of thing. In fact, I don't know if any of you have read where they're taking they're having a pilgrimage. Oh, sorry, after all this stuff of pilgrimages in Jerusalem, I think now we're back to pilgrimages. Anyway, some people like to think of it that way. They're going to take a pilgrimage. Guess where they're going? Montgomery, Alabama.
Oh,
And Selma, they'll be going over the Pettus Bridge. They'll be doing all those things so they can have their picture taken. Sorry, that's my own. That's my own sarcasm. I was raised in that city, and what happened at the Pettus Bridge was, but it still happens today. Still happens today. We haven't finished dealing with that one, have we? So, Anyway, we'll talk about a lot of that stuff next week, but thank you for coming. Thank you. Absolutely.